They say that the walls of the Forbidden City remember everything. Every whisper, every betrayal, every drop of blood that was spilled quietly between the red gates and the shadowed corridors. And if you ever find yourself walking there after the last tourist has gone, and the night begins to press down like an invisible hand, remember this: if you hear a voice calling your name beyond the gate of heavenly purity, do not answer, because it will not be a voice of the living. For centuries, the locals who live near the northern quarter of Beijing have told stories, low, trembling stories, about the nights when the city closes its doors. They speak of guards who vanish, of footsteps that echo when no one is there, of torches that flicker although there's no wind at all. It has become, in a way, a superstition among the keepers. Never stay behind when the iron gates lock, but sometimes superstition is nothing but a gentle warning against what the world refuses to name. The Forbidden City at night is a place of stillness so deep that time seems to stop breathing. The courtyards stretch endlessly under a dim, bruised sky. The wind drifts like a sigh through corridors carved with dragons and fading gold. The scent of old lacquer and dust mingles with something faintly metallic, something that reminds the skin of ancient blood. In the heart of this silence stands a man named Liu Zhen. He is not a man of belief. For the last 12 years, he has worked as a night guard, pacing the empty courtyards after the gates are sealed. To him, the stories are nothing more than leftover echoes of fear, old folk tales meant to frighten the uninitiated. He believes in schedules, in the sound of his flashlight clicking on, in the distant hum of security monitors. But belief means little when the air itself begins to breathe against your skin. It was said that the Forbidden City had 9,999 rooms, though no one could ever count them all. There were blueprints and maps. Yes, but each architect from each dynasty had left secret extensions, hidden alleys, doors that led to nothing, and doors that led to things far older than the emperors themselves. Some corridors were walled off long ago, some rooms locked forever. And yet, every few years, someone would find one more door that wasn't there before. That night was colder than most. The Beijing air was dry and thin, and the stars hung like specks of bone dust over the city. Liu Zhen made his rounds, the soles of his shoes whispering across the stone floor. He passed the Hall of Supreme Harmony, the Hall of Central Peace, the shadow of the Imperial Garden. Everything was where it should be, until he saw it. At the far end of the western wing, beyond the painted balustrade, there was a door, red as dried blood, glistening faintly under the lantern light. He had never noticed it before, though he had walked that corridor 1,000 times. The door looked older than the others. The paint was cracked, darkened by time. A pattern of handprints, faint and brown, stretched across the surface. They were small, like the hands of a child or a woman. The marks had dried into the wood, as though someone had pressed them there long ago, pleading or trying to keep something in. Liu Zhen paused. His breath misted in the cold. He raised his flashlight and read the inscription carved above the frame. The characters were half erased, but he could still make out the old imperial seal, one that hadn't been used since the early Qing Dynasty. He frowned. According to every document he'd ever seen, this section of the West Corridor ended with a blank wall. There should be no door here. He stepped closer. The air changed, subtle but real. It grew heavier, slower, as if the night itself were holding its breath. His light flickered, once, then steadied again. Beneath his boots, the stone was damp. He thought he heard, faintly, the echo of silk rustling, though the corridor was empty. He touched the door. Cold. Colder than any wood should be. And when he pulled his hand back, his fingertips came away marked with red dust. No, not dust. Flakes of dried blood. He told himself it was nothing, some old ritual room perhaps. The place was filled with them, but still a strange unease began to settle in his chest, like something ancient stirring beneath the surface of water. He turned, meaning to call the other guard on the radio, but the line crackled, only static. The sound seemed too loud, too raw against the silence. He turned back to the door. That was when he saw it move, just slightly, a tremor, as though something inside had breathed, and the wood remembered the movement. He stepped back. His heart began to pound, not with fear, not yet, but with the instinct that every human carries from the dawn of time. The instinct that whispers, "You are not alone." For a long while he stood there staring at the door, and in that stillness he heard it, a sound so faint he almost thought it was the wind, a single low hum, like a voice caught behind the walls, a woman's voice, singing. The melody was broken, half-formed, as if sung through water. It rose and fell like mourning. He could not make out the words, but it felt familiar. Something ceremonial, something meant to bind or release. He shone his light again, and for a brief second, just a breath, he thought he saw a figure behind the thin crack where the two panels met. White silk, long black hair, and eyes that glimmered like wet ink. He blinked. The vision was gone. He told himself he was tired, that the mind plays tricks when the night grows too quiet. Still, when he finally turned to leave, he noticed that the air around him had changed again. It no longer smelled of lacquer or dust. It smelled faintly of burned incense. Behind him, the door stood silent. But as he walked away, he could feel, without seeing, that something on the other side had opened its eyes. In every dynasty, there were rites meant to bridge the living and the dead. But when a ritual was left unfinished, the soul bound to it could never rest. And so the door remained, closed to men, open to memory. The guards in the Forbidden City still whisper of it, quietly when the last visitors leave. A red door in the western corridor, marked with brown hands. And if you ever see it, do not touch it, because it remembers the warmth of the last pulse that did. The following morning, the city returned to its rhythm. The tourists arrived again, spilling into the courtyards like a tide of restless color. Guides shouted through microphones, cameras flashed beneath the autumn haze, and the Forbidden City stood silent beneath the noise, ancient, unmoved, as if the stones themselves had learned to forget. Liu Jun, however, could not forget. All through the day, the image of that red door clung to him. The cracked paint, the pale marks of hands, the faint hum like a woman's breath pressed against wood. He had not told anyone. He knew what the others would say. "You're tired. You imagined it." And perhaps he wanted to believe that too. But that night, when the gates closed again with their heavy metallic groan, he found himself walking the same corridor once more. He told himself he only wanted to check, to be sure that what he had seen was simply a trick of shadow. The west wing lay still under the glow of a single lantern. The floor shimmered faintly with a thin layer of frost. The door was there, exactly where it had been. Only this time the handprints looked darker, more defined. He stopped several steps away, listening. Nothing. No voice, no movement, just the sound of his own breathing, slow, measured, uneasy. He raised the flashlight again. The beam slid across the surface of the door, over the seal, down to the base, and then caught something metallic near the handle. A lock, but not a modern one. It was an old bronze clasp, shaped like a serpent biting its tail, the ancient symbol of eternity. Its mouth had rusted shut, yet somehow faint streaks of fresh moisture glistened along its coils. He crouched down, tracing the faint carving beneath the lock. 4 characters carved in deep strokes, the kind that could only have been written with intention, to seal what was begun. The words chilled him. He pulled back, his pulse quickening. That was when he noticed a faint draft seeping from beneath the door. A slow exhale, almost human. And beneath that breath, there was sound again. Not singing this time, something heavier. Rhythmic, like chanting. He couldn't understand the words. The dialect was too old, but the tone was unmistakable. Ceremonial, measured, deliberate. It reminded him of the recordings he'd once heard of ancient court rituals, the rites performed for emperors who were not yet buried, but already dead in all but name. He backed away, nearly dropping his flashlight. The chanting stopped immediately, as if silenced by his fear. Then, 3 knocks. Soft, from the inside. He froze. His throat tightened, breath catching like a trapped insect. The sound came again, clearer this time, resonating through the wood like bones against hollow stone. Once, twice, thrice, then silence. He turned and ran. The long corridor seemed endless, stretching further than it ever had before. His footsteps echoed strangely, overlapping with another set that didn't belong to him. When he reached the central courtyard, the air outside felt too sharp, too cold. He leaned against the marble railing, his body trembling. He stayed there for a long time, until the first thin light of dawn touched the rooftops. When the shift ended, Liujin did something he had never done before. He went into the archives. The Forbidden City's administrative office kept records of every renovation, every restoration, every section sealed by historical order. He searched through brittle folders until the dust made his eyes sting. And at last, in a document from the late 1700s, he found a name that matched the corridor's designation: the Western Chamber of Silent Offering. There was a note attached, written in a faded brushstroke: room sealed under imperial decree after the 13th night of the last lunar rite. The ritual incomplete. Entry forbidden to all living men. The spirit unbound. Beneath that, a second note, unsigned, written decades later in a trembling modern hand. Do not open the Western Chamber. The offering was never finished. Liujin sat back in his chair, staring at the paper. The air in the archive felt heavier than before. He read the last line over and over, until the ink itself seemed to pulse. He didn't tell his supervisor. He didn't tell anyone. But that night when he returned to his post, he brought a small camera with him. He wanted proof, something tangible to explain what his mind refused to settle. When the last light faded from the city and the wind swept over the crimson walls, he walked once more toward the west wing. The corridors were empty, the world hushed. His footsteps echoed like slow drums through the darkness. He turned the corner, and there it was again, that impossible door. Only this time, it stood slightly ajar. A thin line of darkness opened through the gap, breathing faintly like a mouth. He lifted the camera. The red light blinked. He took one step closer, then another. The air thickened. A smell rolled out, sweet and rotten, like flowers that had died too long ago. Inside the darkness, something moved. A shimmer of silk, the whisper of a sleeve brushing against stone. He raised the camera higher, hand trembling. Through the lens, he saw a room no wider than 10 paces. The floor was covered with dust and scattered ashes of burned incense. In the center stood a low wooden altar, its surface stained dark with time. And behind it, upon a raised dais, was a single chair, a throne carved with dragons that had long lost their eyes. Something sat upon it, white fabric draped over its form, motionless, head bowed. The faint outline of a woman's face could be seen beneath the veil, serene, as if in endless prayer. For a moment, Liu Zhen forgot to breathe. He stepped closer, the camera lens adjusted, the red light blinking softly against the pale shape. And then, the figure moved, the head tilted upward, slowly, like something waking from centuries of stillness. There were no eyes beneath the veil, only two deep, hollow sockets, blacker than ink. The camera fell from his hands. It hit the floor, recording sideways. A flicker of red light, a blurred motion, the whisper of fabric. He stumbled backward, reaching for the door. But the air had changed again. The smell of incense thickened, choking him. The chanting returned, now louder, surrounding him, rising from the walls themselves. And then the door slammed shut. He turned, pounding on it, shouting for help. But his voice dissolved into the echoes, swallowed by centuries. Behind him, the chanting grew sharper, faster. The figure beneath the veil began to rise. Her arms unfolded, delicate, impossibly long. And from her hands, thin trails of dark liquid dripped to the floor. Something whispered in his ear, so close it felt like breath. Finish what was begun. Then everything went silent. When they found Liu Zhen the next morning, the west wing was locked. The door to the forbidden chamber was sealed again, this time from the inside. His camera lay broken near the threshold. The last frame it captured showed the red door, half open, and a single hand, pale, delicate, pressing against it from within. No one ever found his body, but at night the guards sometimes hear the faint click of a flashlight moving down the western corridor. And sometimes they say, when the wind shifts just right, a voice hums softly from behind the door. Low, patient, waiting. Beijing slept beneath a veil of smoke and silence. The city had forgotten its emperors, but the forbidden city had not. Within its walls, memory was a kind of hunger. Slow, patient, endless. And now something that had slept too long was beginning to stir. The disappearance of Liu Zhen was noted in a single report. Security officer unaccounted for during night patrol. No further details. The supervisors closed the corridor, sealing it once more with yellow tape and a printed warning. Under restoration. No entry. The tourists passed by, snapping photos of the cordoned area without knowing that beyond that red tape, history had begun to breathe again. Weeks later, a curator named Mei Lin arrived from the Beijing Palace Museum archives. She was young, meticulous, and, like Liu Zhen once had been, skeptical of ghost stories. Her task was to document restricted areas for digital preservation. The Western Wing was on her list. When she was handed the file, she noticed the missing pages. The record ended abruptly with a reference to the 13th lunar rite, an imperial ceremony from the late Qing era, a ritual that, according to legend, was never completed. That evening, she stayed behind in the empty exhibition hall. The sun had already fallen, and the crimson light of dusk bled across the tiled floor. She unfolded the brittle paper from the file and began to read the translation note scribbled in faint ink. On the 13th night, the emperor shall receive the final blessing. The vessel must not speak. The sacrifice must not look upon him. The door must remain closed until the incense burns out. To open it early is to let the spirit walk unbidden among the living. The words felt wrong, the phrasing too sharp, too deliberate. She looked closer. Beneath the brushwork, faint indentations showed another layer of writing that had been scraped away. It took her a moment to make out the hidden phrase, "The emperor is not to return." A chill spread through her spine. Later, as she walked toward the exit, she noticed a faint scent of incense clinging to her sleeves, the kind used only in funerary rites. And though she hadn't gone near the west corridor, A smear of red dust had somehow found its way onto her palm. That night, Mei Lin dreamt of corridors. Endless, silent corridors washed in golden light. At the far end stood a red door, its surface trembling faintly as if breathing. Behind it, a woman's voice whispered, not words, but the steady rhythm of a chant that seeped into her bones. When she awoke, the scent of incense was still there. The next day, she sought out one of the older archivists, a man named Zhang, who had worked at the palace for 40 years. He hesitated when she mentioned the western chamber. His face grew pale, his voice lowering as though afraid the walls might hear. "You shouldn't ask about that room," he said. "It was closed long before any of us were born. They say it was used for the emperor's final ceremony, a purification before death. But something went wrong. The vessel did not die as she was meant to." "The vessel?" Mei Lin asked. "A living woman chosen to carry the emperor's soul between worlds," Zhang whispered. "She was to be sealed in the chamber until dawn. But the emperor died before the ritual ended. They say she was trapped there, neither alive nor dead. The next morning, the priests found the door covered in blood, so they sealed it and never spoke of it again." Mei Lin listened, her heart heavy with the same uneasy pull that had haunted Liu Jin weeks before. That evening, when the palace emptied and the sound of footsteps faded into the wind, she found herself walking, almost unconsciously, toward the forbidden wing. The yellow tape hung loose, swaying faintly as she brushed past it. The corridor smelled of cold stone and forgotten incense. She stood before the red door. It was smaller than she expected. The paint was darker, the patterns of handprints still visible though dulled by age. She raised her flashlight and traced the edges of the bronze serpent lock. It was still there, its coils gleaming faintly like the skin of something alive. She didn't touch it, not yet. Instead, she noticed something etched faintly into the lower panel of the door. A mark like a crescent moon surrounded by 12 smaller circles. Beneath it, more writing in faded ink. "When the 13th moon rises, the right shall seek its vessel." Her breath caught. The date on her phone screen glowed softly. The 13th day of the lunar month. Somewhere deep in the palace, a bell began to sound. Long, slow, ancient. It wasn't supposed to ring at that hour. The sound rolled through the hallways, heavy and hollow, like time itself being struck. And from behind the red door came the faintest reply, a single tone, like the echo of a bell struck in answer. Mei Lin stepped back, heart pounding. The lock on the door began to tremble, tiny flecks of rust falling like dust. She could swear she heard footsteps inside, measured and soft, pacing in slow circles. Then a whisper, not quite a voice, more like breath passing through silk. "The Emperor waits." She turned to run, but the corridor behind her was gone. Where the open passage should have been, now stretched a long tunnel lit by wavering candlelight. The walls were draped in crimson banners. The air shimmered with heat and the faint scent of blood. She tried to scream, but the sound dissolved into the low rising hum that filled the space. A chant, endless and ancient. And then she saw them. Figures kneeling in the shadows. Men and women in ceremonial robes, their faces covered by veils of white silk. Their heads bowed, hands pressed together in unison. In the center of their circle, an empty throne stood beneath a canopy of black lacquer and gold. Something unseen walked toward it. She couldn't see the face, only the movement. Graceful, deliberate, carrying the weight of centuries. When the figure turned, the candlelight touched a veil of white fabric, and beneath it, a hollow face she knew from her dreams. The vessel. Her lips moved, but the words were not her own. The rite was never finished. The emperor still waits. The veiled woman reached out a pale hand, pointing toward Mei Lin. The chanting grew louder. The room began to pulse. She stumbled backward, reaching for the door. But there was no door anymore. Only a wall of red silk trembling like a living thing. The world tilted, blurred, swallowed itself whole. And then, silence. When the guards came the next morning, the yellow tape was gone. The west corridor looked exactly as it always had. Only one thing had changed. The red door was closed again, and fresh handprints, smaller this time, new, stained the wood. They never found Mei Lin, but some nights when the moon hangs low over the city, the wind carries faint chanting from the western wing, soft, slow, patient, as though the ritual still continues. And those who hear it say it always ends with the same whisper, almost gentle, almost kind. The emperor waits. When nights that followed Mei Lin's disappearance grew unnaturally still, the guards whispered of strange echoes rising from the west corridor, though no one dared to linger long enough to listen. Sometimes when the wind slipped through the cracks between the tiles, it carried with it the faintest trace of a song, low, mournful, like silk brushing across stone. The administrators sealed the wing again. The lock was reinforced, the hall lights replaced. The official explanation, structural instability. But those who worked there knew better. They avoided that corridor as if the air itself had turned poisonous. Yet the whispers persisted. 3 weeks later, a new night supervisor, Chen Hao, took the position. He was in his mid-40s, quiet, pragmatic, the kind of man who did not believe in anything he could not measure. He had heard the rumors, of course, every newcomer did, but he dismissed them with the same weary patience one gives to children's tales. On his first night, he was handed Liu Jin's old patrol route. The paper was faded, his name still printed neatly at the top. When Chen traced the line of the route with his finger, he noticed something odd. The path looped back upon itself, ending precisely where it began. A closed circuit, the kind of route that should have taken 30 minutes, but according to the time logs, always took nearly 2 hours. He thought little of it then. That night, the forbidden city was silent beneath a brittle winter moon. The air hung motionless, too cold even for the stray dogs that sometimes prowled the courtyards. The lamps along the walls flickered weakly, their light swallowed by the vastness of the dark. As Chen Hao began his rounds, his radio crackled faintly, then fell quiet again. He passed through the gate of supreme harmony, his footsteps echoing between stone lions whose eyes gleamed faintly in the lantern glow. Beyond them, the long corridor stretched into nothingness. He counted his steps, 140 to the west arch, 50 to the turn. His rhythm was steady, precise, until it wasn't. At step 141, he should have seen the carved balustrade, but instead the path continued. Endless, identical, a corridor folding into itself like the inside of a mirrored box. He stopped. Behind him, the gate he'd passed through was gone. The air shifted, no longer cold but heavy, almost wet, as though the night had grown lungs and begun to breathe. The silence changed too. It was no longer empty. It listened. He turned on his flashlight. The beam caught the shimmer of dust suspended midair. The walls, once crimson, now seemed darker, closer to black. And then he heard it, a voice, faint, beneath the floor. Not a whisper this time, but a murmur, steady, layered, hundreds of tones blending together into a single chant. He crouched, pressing his ear to the stone. The sound was unmistakable. Human voices, deep beneath the ground, reciting something in perfect unison. He couldn't understand the language, but he recognized the cadence. It was ritualistic, deliberate, the same rhythm that echoes when monks chant for the dead. Then came the second sound, A single knock from below. He stepped back, heart pounding, scanning the floor. His light revealed a narrow crack running through the stone, almost invisible, as if two slabs had been separated by the width of a breath. From within that crack, a thin ribbon of smoke rose, a pale silvery mist that smelled of burned incense and rotted silk. The chant grew louder. He followed the line of the crack with his light. It led all the way down the corridor to the very end, where a large red gate stood. He had never seen it before, though every map said there was none. The gate of earthly rest. The characters above it read. The calligraphy was elegant, imperial, the kind reserved for tomb inscriptions. The ground beneath his boots trembled faintly. The chanting swelled, pressing against his skull like waves. His breath fogged the air, but the mist did not move with him. It hung still, as though the corridor had forgotten the laws of breath and wind. Chen Hao stepped closer. The gate loomed high, carved with coiling dragons devouring one another. Between their jaws, faint streaks of brown, like blood drawn centuries ago. He touched the wood. It was warm, and beneath his hand, something pulsed once, faintly like a heartbeat. He jerked back. The chanting stopped instantly. The silence that followed was absolute, dense enough to ring in his ears. Then a woman's voice spoke from the other side. "Who stands before the throne of dust?" He froze. The words were old, formal, carrying the resonance of command. He tried to speak, but his throat tightened. "Who stands before the throne of dust?" the voice repeated, softer now, almost kind. He swallowed hard. "Security," he managed, his voice trembling. "I'm a guard." The silence returned. Then very faintly, a sound like laughter, dry, breathless, echoing. "You are not what was promised." The gate shuddered. A sudden gust of wind swept through the corridor, extinguishing every lamp. The darkness closed around him, absolute. The air smelled of ashes and rose petals. And then he saw it, the faintest outline of a figure behind the gate, a silhouette wrapped in flowing robes, face obscured by a long veil. She stood perfectly still, her presence colder than the marble beneath his feet. Her hand rose slowly and pressed against the gate. The wood beneath his palm grew hot, searing. He stumbled back, his flashlight flickering. When the light steadied, the figure was gone, but her handprint remained, burned black into the wood. He ran. He didn't know for how long, minutes, hours. The corridors twisted endlessly, each turn leading back to the same gate. The air rang with whispers now, countless voices overlapping, calling his name, not loudly, but insistently, as if coaxing him closer to something unseen. "Chen Hao! Chen Hao! Come see!" He covered his ears, but the sound was inside his head now. The chanting rose again, beneath the floor, beneath his heartbeat. His flashlight went dark. For a moment there was only breathing, his and something else's. Then he felt it, a pulse of warmth spreading beneath his feet. Light seeped from the cracks in the floor, faint and red, like molten glass. Shapes began to move within it, shadows of figures kneeling, bowing, rising, repeating the same motions again and again, as though trapped in an eternal ceremony. At the center of their circle stood a throne, empty, waiting. The light flared once, blinding. When he opened his eyes again, the corridor was gone. He stood in a vast hall lit by thousands of candles. Incense coiled through the air, thick enough to choke. And in front of him, upon the throne, sat the veiled woman, the vessel. Her voice was softer now, almost tender. "The emperor waits, but the vessel cannot serve alone. The living must take his place." He tried to step back, but his feet would not move. His body felt weightless, unmoored. The candles flickered violently. The chanting reached its peak, and then silence. The next morning, the guards found the corridor empty. The gate remained untouched, but beneath it, faint trails of footprints led away, burned into the stone as though seared there by fire. Chen Hao's patrol sheet was discovered later in the control room. The route was different this time. It no longer looped back to the start. It ended clearly, deliberately, at the words, "Gate of Earthly Rest," and below it, written in his handwriting, a single line, "He has awakened." The report on Chen Hao's disappearance never made it to the public. It was buried, quietly, efficiently, beneath layers of official paperwork in the familiar phrase, "Personnel lost due to health complications." But among the night staff, his story spread like infection. The corridors of the Forbidden City began to feel heavier, slower, as if something vast had shifted beneath the foundations, unseen yet undeniable. On the 13th night after Chen vanished, the moon turned the color of old iron. Clouds hung unnaturally low, pressing against the city's eaves. A thin mist crept from the ground, pale as ash, curling between the carved dragons that lined the terraces. In the control room, Liang Wen, one of the senior supervisors, was reviewing the CCTV feeds. He was a man of logic, a bureaucrat who trusted paper more than prayer. But that night, as the clock struck midnight, every screen flickered. For 3 seconds, all 12 cameras went black. When they came back online, the feed showed something impossible. Every courtyard was filled with people. They stood in perfect rows, dressed in robes of scarlet and gold, their faces obscured by veils. In their hands, they held ceremonial lanterns, hundreds of them, burning with a cold blue flame. Liang froze, replaying the footage. The timestamp remained correct. The angles didn't glitch. It wasn't old footage. It was happening now. He switched to camera 12, the west corridor, the one they had sealed. The red gate was open. A faint mist bled through the lens, swirling like ink in water. At its center, something moved. A figure in imperial robes, wearing the Mianlu crown of a long-dead emperor. The headpiece shimmered with strands of jade and gold, each bead reflecting light that didn't belong to this world. The emperor did not look at the camera, yet Liang felt as though the gaze pierced directly through the lens. And then the feed went dark again. Outside, the guards began reporting strange things. Footsteps echoing in locked courtyards, bells ringing from empty towers, the sound of music drifting faintly through the halls, flutes, drums, strings, ancient instruments no longer used in any ceremony. When they followed the sound, it led them to the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The great bronze doors, sealed for decades, stood open. Lanterns glowed within. Dust floated in the air, disturbed by a rhythm, like invisible feet moving in time to an unseen orchestra. Liang, shaking, led the group inside. The hall was filled with mist. The walls, once faded red, now gleamed wet and fresh as though painted that very night. The ceiling dragons seemed to move, their eyes glinting, and upon the dais, the dragon throne. Someone was sitting there. The figure wore the robes of the Yongjung emperor. His face was pale, flawless, yet wrong. The flesh looked too smooth, too still, like lacquer over bone. His eyes were open but unfocused, the pupils a deep, bottomless black. At his feet knelt rows of courtiers, perfectly still, their robes whispering faintly as though stirred by a breeze that wasn't there. Then, one by one, they turned their heads. Every face was hollow, literally. Where the features should have been, there were only smooth surfaces of stretched skin, no eyes, no mouths. Yet somehow, from that emptiness, a chorus of voices rose. The Emperor has returned. The night remembers. The sound vibrated through the floor, through the bones of every man present. Liang tried to speak, but his mouth refused to move. His tongue felt heavy, as though someone else's breath filled his lungs. From the dais, the figure in imperial robes slowly raised his hand. At that moment, the moon outside bled through the windows, staining everything in shades of rust red. The light pulsed once, twice, then burst. Every lamp in the hall extinguished at once. Darkness. Then faintly, the sound of chanting again, the same as Chen Hao had heard. But now it filled the entire palace, echoing across rooftops, through chambers, down into the earth itself. Every gate in the Forbidden City began to open. Old wooden hinges creaked, ancient iron bolts snapped loose. Doors that hadn't been touched in centuries swung wide. And from the shadows behind them, figures began to emerge. First, servants carrying trays of offerings, bowls of blackened rice, cups of wine thick as blood. Then soldiers in armor that shimmered with phantom fire. Then the concubines drifting like smoke, faces painted white, and mouths sealed shut. All moving in one direction, toward the gate of earthly rest. Liang stumbled after them, his radio sputtering with static. When he reached the courtyard, he saw it. Thousands of ghostly figures gathered beneath the moon, their forms flickering between past and present. At the center stood the veiled woman, the vessel. She was radiant now, her body glowing faintly from within, like a lantern lit by a heart that refused to die. Her voice carried effortlessly through the night. Tonight, the court convenes once more. The 13th night calls all who were forgotten. The ground trembled. The incense burners along the courtyard blazed to life. The air grew thick with the scent of sandalwood and decay. One by one, the spectral courtiers began to kneel. The vessel raised her hands. The mist coiled around her, forming shapes, faces of those who had perished centuries ago. And then, with a sound like thunder muffled by earth, the throne appeared again. It did not descend. It grew, pushing itself out of the ground, as though the palace itself remembered its emperor. Upon it, the veiled woman placed a crown, a circlet of black jade still dripping with some dark fluid. "He shall reign until the silence devours heaven," she whispered. Liang's body locked in place. He couldn't move, couldn't scream. He could only watch as the emperor's head slowly turned toward him. The air between them folded inward, like the world had forgotten its own shape. For a brief, horrifying second, Liang saw through the emperor's eyes, saw the palace not as it was, but as it had once been, alive, bright, filled with thousands of living souls bowing to him. And then the vision fractured. He was back in the hall, alone. The mist was gone, the lights dead, the throne empty. But beneath his feet, faint cracks glowed red again, the same as before. And from the depths came the steady beat of a drum, slow, ancient, unending. Thump, thump, thump. He fled the palace that night. He never returned. But before he left Beijing, he recorded one final message on the control room tape. His voice trembled, distant, as if he was speaking from far away. "The 13th night has begun. The city is remembering itself. They are not ghosts. They are memories too heavy to die." The tape ended with a single knock. And silence. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. Soft, endless, covering the crimson roofs like a burial shroud. And deep within the Forbidden City, beneath the gate of earthly rest, something exhaled, a breath that had waited 300 years. When dawn came, the guards found nothing. The courtyard was empty, the halls silent. Only the air carried something faint and wrong, a scent like burnt sandalwood mixed with rust. The officials who reviewed Liang Wen's footage found it corrupted, replaced with static. The ministry declared it an equipment malfunction. By noon, the palace resumed its sterile rhythm. Tourists returned, laughing beneath the marble lions. The echo of footsteps vanished beneath the hum of cameras and the shuffle of guided tours. But night does not forget, and that night, as the lights dimmed and the last tourist bus pulled away, the forbidden city exhaled again. A wind rose, gentle at first, then thick with dust. It moved down the empty corridors like something searching. The paper charms nailed to the walls fluttered weakly, their ink bleeding into the air like whispers. At the very heart of the inner court, the gate of earthly rest opened once more. No human hand touched it, no sound of hinges, no groan of old wood. It simply parted. Beyond it, a glow emerged, golden, soft, hypnotic. The kind of light that once came from thousands of lanterns lit for a royal feast. But this was not the warmth of life. It was memory. If one stood close enough, one could hear faint music, zithers, flutes, and the hum of an unseen choir. A table stretched across the courtyard, its surface laden with dishes of impossible color. Pomegranates split open like wounds. Roasted fowl glistening, though centuries should have turned them to dust. Wine that shimmered like blood in moonlight. The emperor sat at the head of the table. Around him the court assembled once more. Concubines, ministers, servants, guards, all formed from mist and fragments of time, flickering between bodies and absence. And among them, at the very end of the table, sat a figure that did not belong. Chen Hao. His eyes were open now, black as the wax that had sealed his mouth. He moved slowly, as if guided by strings. When the emperor raised his cup, Chen did the same. From the darkness above, the veiled vessel descended, her bare feet hovering inches above the ground. Her veil no longer white. It had turned crimson, soaked in something that dripped with every step she took. She walked the length of the table, pouring wine into the cups of the dead. When she reached Chen Hao, she paused. "The final offering," she whispered. "The gate remembers its guardian." Her fingers brushed his forehead, and at her touch, his body convulsed. Smoke bled from his mouth, forming shapes, memories, faces, years, the shape of a life being unstitched. Then the emperor spoke. His voice was like wind passing through hollow wood, low and infinite. The dynasty never ended. The empire never slept. The offering was only delayed. At his words, the entire feast began to move. The courtiers lifted their cups in unison. The music swelled, discordant, ancient. The ground trembled again, not violently, but rhythmically, in time with the song. A pulse, a heartbeat, something enormous awakening below. And then, from beneath the table, hands emerged, dozens of them, then hundreds, pale, emaciated hands clawing upward through the stone floor, grasping for cups, for food, for flesh. The courtiers did not flinch. They welcomed the touch. Their mouths opened, black voids filled with smoke, and began to eat. The air thickened, shimmering with heat that was not heat at all. It was hunger, ancient ceremonial hunger. At the center of it all, the emperor raised his hand again. The golden crown upon his head began to melt, dripping down his face in rivers of golden blood. His skin peeled back, revealing the lacquered skull beneath, polished, perfect, smiling. "To complete the offering," he said, "a living witness must join the feast." And at that moment, the mist at the courtyard's edge shifted. A flashlight beam cut through it, weak, trembling. Two modern guards, sent to check the disturbance, stepped into the glow. Their radios hissed with static. They saw the feast. At first, they thought it was a projection, some late-night rehearsal for a festival. Then one of the specters turned toward them. The guard dropped his flashlight. What stood before him wasn't a man. It was a reflection. His own face, but centuries older, eyes hollow, lips moving silently in perfect unison with his own breath. He tried to step back, but the reflection followed. And when it smiled, the guard screamed. Though no sound came out, the feast erupted. The courtiers rose as one, their movements sudden, inhumanly fluid. The vessels on the table shattered. Wine turned to smoke. The lanterns burst into blue flame. The two guards ran, but the corridors twisted, bending in on themselves. Every path led back to the courtyard. Behind them, laughter, not joyous, but hollow, a sound like wind passing through bone. The vessel's voice followed, soft and clear, as if spoken directly into their ears. The forbidden city is not made of stone. It is made of memory, and every memory hungers to be remembered. One guard vanished first, swallowed by the mist. The other fell to his knees, gasping, eyes wide. He saw the red gate before him, the one with the dried handprint. This time, it wasn't dry. The blood was fresh, glistening in the dim light. A hand pressed against it from the other side. Slowly, the gate began to open. The last thing the guard heard was the whisper of the emperor, close enough to feel the breath, though no lungs moved. The banquet continues. You are late. And then, silence again. The next morning, the palace reopened as usual. Tourists walked past the Crimson Gate, taking photos, laughing. No one noticed the faint stain spreading outward from the bottom of the door. A dark, sticky mark shaped like fingers dragging toward the ground. In the shadows beneath the eaves, a single lantern flickered, its flame a cold blue. And for a brief moment, just long enough for a camera to miss it, the reflection of a full feast shimmered on its surface. The feast of shadows had begun again. And somewhere deep beneath the forbidden city, something vast and ancient smiled. They say dreams are the language of souls that cannot speak, but in the forbidden city, dreams are not born. They are inherited. 3 nights after the Feast of Shadows, no one dared take the night shift. The official report listed it as structural restoration. Yet those who worked near the inner court whispered of hearing footsteps long after curfew echoing across the marble floors. Some said they saw candlelight in the Hall of Supreme Harmony. Others swore they smelled incense burning when no shrine had been lit for centuries. But the truth is this: the palace had begun to dream again. It started with the survivors. Liang Wen was found in a small apartment on the edge of Beijing. He had quit his job, shaved his head, and taped every window shut. He hadn't slept in days. When the investigator came, Liang sat in the dark, his eyes unfocused, muttering. "He's not gone," he whispered. "He just blinked." They asked him who. Liang did not answer. Instead, he pointed to the ceiling, where the faint outline of a red handprint had begun to bloom through the paint. That night, Liang dreamt of the emperor. He stood once more in the grand hall. The throne gleamed beneath silver moonlight, but now the emperor was alone. His court gone, his crown cracked, his robes soaked in black fluid that dripped endlessly onto the tiles. "You saw my feast," the emperor said. "Now you will dream it." Liang tried to run, but his legs refused him. He looked down. His feet had turned to marble, roots binding him to the floor. The emperor descended the dais, each step echoing like thunder in a tomb. His eyes, 2 deep wells of darkness, met Liang's, and in that gaze, Liang saw something that made his heart seize. He was not looking at the emperor. He was looking at himself, in another time, wearing another life. A soldier kneeling before the throne, blade still wet from a royal execution 300 years ago. The emperor smiled. "You swore to guard me," he said, "even in death." When Liang woke, his pillow was damp. He reached up and touched his face. His fingers came away streaked with crimson dust. The next day, his neighbors said they heard chanting through the walls. By morning, his apartment was empty. But that night, a new guard was assigned to the Forbidden City. His name was Zhou Min, a man of 35, recently transferred from the Beijing municipal force. He had heard the rumors, the vanished men, the whispers, and dismissed them. He believed in locks, not legends, until he saw the gate, the crimson door with the dried handprint. It was said to be sealed, but when Joe passed it, he felt a gust of cold air brush his cheek, as if something within had breathed out. He stopped, shone his flashlight. The light flickered once, then steadied. And there, on the surface of the door, he saw a movement, a reflection, not his own. It was the emperor's face, eyes closed, serene, as though sleeping beneath the paint. And then, slowly, one eye opened. Joe stumbled back, his breath freezing in his chest. The air around him shimmered, bent, and suddenly, the palace was not empty anymore. He was standing in the Hall of Tranquil Longevity, though it looked nothing like the museum version he'd known. Lanterns hung in neat rows, burning with steady flame. The sound of flutes and zithers floated through the air. Servants glided past him, bowing deeply as they carried trays of food, but none of them had faces. Joe realized he was inside the dream, or perhaps the dream had opened itself around him. At the far end of the hall, the emperor sat once more upon the throne, but now his form wavered, at times solid, at times smoke. He looked not at Joe, but through him. "The feast must end," the emperor said softly, "but the dream must go on." Joe felt the floor tremble. The tapestries along the walls fluttered, their painted dragons twisting, coiling, alive. He heard whispers in languages he did not know, ancient syllables, sharp and deliberate, falling into rhythm. Jiexian Cheng Wang, Fuli Wei Wan. The ritual was never completed. The gate was never closed. The emperor raised a hand, and the air thickened with gold dust. Shapes began to emerge from the haze. Memories, fragments of time, looping endlessly. Courtiers laughing, servants kneeling, a concubine weeping before the red gate. And then Joe saw him. Chen Hao standing among them, eyes empty, holding a lantern that burned with blue fire. Chen turned his head, and for the first time his lips moved. "Wake up," he whispered. The hall collapsed inward. Joe gasped, jerking awake, or thought he did. He was standing in the same place, the same hall, the same flickering lights. But now the emperor was gone, the throne empty. Only the echo of the whisper remained. "Wake up." He stumbled through corridor after corridor, searching for an exit. But every gate he reached opened to another hall, another courtyard, another world trapped in reflection. Finally, he found a mirror. Tall, cracked, ancient. He leaned toward it. In its surface, he saw the Forbidden City. Not as it was now, but as it had been centuries ago. The roofs gleamed with fresh vermilion paint. The banners snapped in the wind, and the sky was filled with the shimmer of fireworks celebrating a dynasty that had already died. And then, in the reflection, he saw himself, standing beside the emperor, bowing, smiling, holding a blade. He screamed, but the sound did not leave his throat. Instead, the reflection smiled wider. "The dream was never mine," it said. "It was yours." The mirror shattered. Joe felt a searing pain across his face, and when he looked down, Shards of glass reflected not his eyes, but dozens of others staring back at him from the floor. When dawn came, the next guard found his uniform neatly folded outside the control room. His radio was still on. From the speaker came a single whisper, looping endlessly. "Do not dream within these walls. They remember what you are." That day, the museum closed again, for maintenance. But those who live near the Forbidden City still say that some nights, when the moon turns copper and the wind carries the faint scent of sandalwood, they see lights flickering through the halls, like candles floating in water. And if you listen closely enough, through the static of the air, you might hear a voice, low, rhythmic, reciting something too old to translate. The gate is open. The feast continues. The emperor dreams through us all. They sealed the palace again. Concrete, cameras, restrictions, an attempt to cage the past. But the past does not live behind doors. It lives inside the ones who remember. Weeks passed. The ministry declared the Forbidden City under renovation. Eternal reporters whispered of accidents, unconfirmed disappearances, static-filled transmissions that bled through radio frequencies at midnight. Some said the recordings were of wind. Others claimed they were chanting. But those who have heard it, truly heard it, know it is not wind at all. It is breath, the breath of something that does not sleep. In the heart of the city, near the Jingshan Hill, there is a window that overlooks the old palace roofs. Every night a man sits there, drinking in silence. He used to be a guard. No one remembers his name. He doesn't speak to anyone now, except to the glass before him. The reflection he no longer trusts, because some nights it moves before he does. When the moon reaches its peak, he sees it again. The faint outline of the red gate beneath the layered shadows of the eaves. It always seems closer than the night before. He once tried to leave Beijing. He made it to the train station, but when the train passed through the first tunnel, the window beside his seat reflected not darkness, but vermilion walls and golden tiles glistening under a pale sky. And there, sitting opposite him in the reflection, was a man wearing imperial robes, head bowed, fingers tracing the rim of a cup filled with something dark. "You left the door open," the man whispered. The train emerged from the tunnel. The seat was empty, but the cup remained, small, lacquered, still warm. They say the emperor's spirit was bound by ritual, a grand sacrifice to bridge heaven and earth. But the rite was interrupted, the vessel incomplete. So the palace began to feed itself on memory, using those who entered it as fragments of the ceremony that never finished. Somewhere, deep beneath the gate of earthly rest, a scroll lies unfurled across a stone table. The ink upon it never dries. Each time someone dreams of the palace, another line appears, written not by hand, but by thought. The scroll tells a single story, repeating itself in endless loops. Of a guard who opened a forbidden door. Of an emperor who waited 300 years to be remembered. Of a gate that breathes. At midnight, if you walk past the palace walls, you might feel a strange pull, a pressure in your chest, a whisper in your ear. The air tastes of dust and sandalwood, and somewhere inside, a faint blue light glimmers just beyond the last courtyard. No one knows where it truly leads, but those who have dared to look closer say the light comes from a single lantern hanging before the red gate. Its paint now cracked, the shape of a dried handprint still visible. Sometimes the lantern sways, though there is no wind. And sometimes, when the silence deepens enough, a voice calls softly from behind the gate. You should not be here after closing time. It is never shouted. It is calm, patient, familiar. The tone of a watchman reminding you of rules you should already know. If you answer even in a whisper, the sound echoes far too long, and the next thing you hear is the slow creak of the door beginning to open. Those who have heard it say the world changes after that. Time folds, sound thickens, and every breath feels older than it should. Some wake in their beds trembling, unsure whether they ever left the palace at all. Others vanish entirely. But sometimes, on nights when the fog crawls low across the marble lions and the moon bleeds through the smog like pale fire, a figure can be seen walking the upper walls of the Forbidden City. His uniform is faded, his flashlight dead, and as he passes each courtyard, the lanterns light themselves one by one in silent recognition. He pauses at the last gate, the one painted red with old blood, and turns as though listening to something only he can hear. The air stills, the city holds its breath. Then softly, almost kindly, his voice drifts into the night. The Emperor is still dreaming. A moment later, all the lanterns go out. By dawn, Beijing wakes to a gray sky. The tourists return. The laughter, the cameras, the endless footsteps resume. No one notices that the red gate has moved again. Just a few feet, just enough for the shadow to fall a little differently than yesterday. No one sees the faint trace of a hand pressed against the glass of the museum office window, perfectly shaped, perfectly still. No one hears the quiet murmur echoing through the speaker system, almost drowned beneath the hum of morning crowds. The ritual awaits completion. The 13th night will come again, and when it does, the palace will open its gates once more. Not for the dead, not for the living, but for those who dare to listen too long. Because in the Forbidden City, time does not move forward. It circles endlessly, waiting for one final witness to close the gate. Until then, it remains open, always, the gate that never closes.